Let's try that again. Howdy. So my name is Cody Green. I'm a cloud architect with F5 Networks. Today we're going to talk about application security and a CI/CD pipeline. Now, when most of you see this picture, you probably see a bunch of junk. For one of my customers, though, they had a business unit whose responsibility it was to sell surplus or equipment the company no longer used. Now, this particular business unit was a necessity, but it wasn't terribly profitable. This business unit got an idea. Let's hire a college intern. Let's have them write an auction, and we'll build it in AWS. Good idea, right? Unbeknownst to them at the time, the idea takes off. That particular business unit starts to really gain in popularity and starts generating a profit. So you can imagine what happens when IT figures out that there's a security or an app that's gone production that wasn't scanned. So like any good security department, they scanned the application. There were no vulnerabilities. I'm kidding. There were tons. It was developed by an intern. Nothing against that. I was an intern. But you don't typically code securely, right? We're not taught that in college. And so this particular app had a lot of vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed. Now, why do I tell you the story? Because this is one of the few times in my career where I saw the CISO was overruled by the CIO. This particular business unit did exactly what the CIO wanted. They found a pain point. They identified a way to solve that pain point and to identify it securely. What would have normally happened? Normally, we would have slapped the business unit on the hand and said, hey, fix your code, we're going to take your site offline. That's not the case here. The site stayed online even though there were known vulnerabilities against it because it was profitable and it did exactly what the CIO and the president wanted. Now, I tell you this to then ask you, what is the worst thing you can deploy an application without? Probably know the answer, right? Security. So F5 publishes our State of Application Services report every year. And year over year, we've seen a rising answer that security is one of the most critical things that has to be deployed with an application. Why? Well, if we were taking a look at this 5 years ago, most of us were probably deploying in a data center that we knew and we trusted. So app security, while terribly important at that point in time, is not something we felt as vulnerable about. However, now most of our applications are actually being deployed in a public cloud. We either do or don't know the type of security that's wrapped around them. And more importantly, we may be going further out than what our security teams are capable of, hence the example before. Now, so why is app security still an issue in deployments? We've been doing this for quite some time, right? I was doing automated deployments, back in the late 2000s. And this is something that we have to be able to look at and say, what is the cause? Because it's not a technology issue per se. And for me, what I typically see across most organizations is a cultural issue. So we're going to dig into some of the cultural things, and we'll start with silos. Now, we're all familiar with silos, right? I've been a part of one. You've probably all been a part of one. You either work in security, you work in operations, you work in development. And silos cause friction, right? I care about what gets my department the greatest level of success. When I was in security, that meant that making sure that we had no vulnerabilities or no breaches. If you came to me and said, hey, we've got to get to market in 2 days, I'd be like, should have submitted the ticket a week ago, right? That doesn't help. That causes friction. So we're trying to help customers enable multi-team environments. This gets into that DevSecOps mentality. Now, DevOps has been around for well over 10 years. However, security didn't always have a seat at the table. The other thing that I've noticed is we have issues when we start looking at pipelines. Not all security vendors have enabled their products to be automated in a pipeline fashion. So this also causes frictions in the silos. And then finally, security is an afterthought. How many of y'all go into a project kickoff meeting and one of the requirements that you list out on the board that this project or this new app must obtain is, hey, it's got to be secure. You're awesome. But most of us don't, right? It's something that we know, okay, before I go into production, yeah, security's got to scan it. This causes that friction, that silo. We need to be able to get around this. Now, the other cultural thing we'll touch on is trust. So who's been a part of a DevOps team or a DevSecOps team? Okay, quite a few of you. Were you a silo in your organization? Most of the time I find that they are. And the reason this is a concern is because you're not given the trust or the empowerment to solve the problems that you were initially targeted with. Yes, you may be successful on a handful of applications, but for us to really succeed in DevOps or DevSecOps, we have to have the trust from the entire organization. And we have to remove some of the hierarchy or bureaucracy that limits those teams. So I'll give you a perfect example. How many of y'all are allowed to obtain certificates, right? Like SSL certificates? A handful of you. Most developers I work with, they can't. Security is like, no, that won't happen, right? That's something they have to put a ticket in, and we have to control that. The other thing is facilitating, trust facilitates secure practices. Now, some of you may say, well, hold on, Cody. You're telling me to trust them, and they'll do what they're supposed to do. There is a trust but verify mentality that we have to implement here. But yes, we need to trust the developers and the DevSecOps teams to do the right thing for the company so that they can achieve the speed that they're after, but also that we're giving them tools that have best practices built into them. And then the last thing here is allowing innovation. I've seen some amazing things come from departments that allow security, operations, and developers to all work together. New ways of release, new ways to address security problems. If we're not trusting those teams to move at a faster pace and choose the resources or the tools that's right for them, we are stifling innovation. The final thing is ownership. Now, this probably comes as no surprise to anyone here, right? Everyone has to own the release. Now, I've worked in my career in development and operations, and I've been guilty of this, right? I write the code, I throw it over the fence. Who's seen the meme of the house on fire and it says, worked in dev, ops problem now, right? That was me. I've also been in operations, and to the bane of my existence, if I never hear it worked on my laptop again, then I will be happy. Everyone has to own the release. And that means that we all have to work to ensuring that security is part of the build process, and more importantly, part of the initial design of the project. The other thing is you have to meet your developers halfway, right? If you want a seat at that table, if your teams are using test-driven development patterns, then A, you should know what those are. B, provide some examples, right? How can those teams integrate with that? I love the example you had earlier about here's not what to do and here's what to do. That is phenomenal, right? Because we need to provide examples. We want our developers to innately include security practices into the releases. But if all we're doing is coming around after the fact and slapping them on the hand, then that's not helping, right? Instead, we need to give them better ways to achieve security through the tools they're using. And more importantly, you need to understand what those are. So I mentioned this one because I do work with a lot of security teams. And one of the patterns that I've seen over the last few years is things that we've done for a long time in development are starting to happen in security. Being able to do things like test-driven development, things like integration tests, right? Typically, security was used to doing a scan at some point closer to production. We're teaching security practitioners how to be more like developers. And so we have to meet them halfway. So how can we design for success? So one of the things I do at F5 is I help customers build deployment patterns for hybrid clouds that enable the application delivery and application security requirements they have today, but also for the next couple of years. And for those of us that have been in security for some time, we're probably used to that hard outer shell mentality, like the M&M effect, that everything at the edge must be secure. And this is where you had your large monolithic firewalls, your large monolithic API gateways, your large monolithic web application firewalls. But we've seen trends where customers were implementing microsegmentation inside of their private data centers. That as a new business unit or app team decides to go cloud native, they're given their own VPC or their own resource group so that they can code their app and not affect anyone else. So we have to take the same approach that the developers are taking inside of security, and that is slay the monolith, right? What resources need to still live at the edge, and what resources can move closer to the app? So prime example, something like denial of service. That's still a really good thing to live at the edge. I don't necessarily want that DOS attack to go all the way down to the VPC where the app lives. But when we look at things like API gateways, when we look at web application firewalls, we've seen the adoption of micro proxies and micro API gateways really take off. And this is where we're moving those down into your pipeline, and now the app team has the ability to configure them. So this means that they can move at their release cadence, not at the traditional ticketing release cadence. So that empowerment becomes an important part of that. I have to empower the developer. Now, security must be built in. You've heard me mention this, and you'll hear me say it a couple more times. But we have to create patterns that allow security teams and development teams to ensure that they are achieving the velocity or speed that they want, but the underlying security is there. We also have to make it easy for business units to choose, or application teams, to choose the tool that's right for them. So how many of y'all have had a security product, for lack of a better term, kind of shoved down your throat, that this is the firewall we use, or this is the WAF we use, and everyone must use it? Well, a few of you. And the thing that we look at is the app teams to move at the pace that they need to get, right? If you're releasing once a month, and you want to start releasing weekly, does me trying to force a security product on you cause you to release faster? The answer is typically no. But you choosing a security product that enables you to move at the release cadence that you want, right? If I use Azure DevOps, and there's tools that natively integrate with Azure DevOps, and those could allow me to move faster, wouldn't that be the right thing for my app team or my business unit? What we want security to do is enable that development team to make those decisions, right? This is that trust but verify. We have to implement tools that allow us to ensure the app is secured, but not force particular vendors or particular stacks upon those teams. Ideally, I want to be able to give you a data plane, whatever that data plane is. You can choose that, and we can layer security upon that data plane. This gets into automation, right? And automation is a critical component of making this work in your pipelines. Now, automation has to include everything. How many of y'all can automate 80% of your application deployments? How many of you can automate 90% of your application deployments? A couple of you. How many can automate 100%? Small subset. A lot of teams I work with, when we talk about automation, one of the directors of automation at one of my customers, he put it in a very funny way. He's like, I just want to get to 80%. I'm like, 80% of what? I'm like, if I still have to request a certificate or DNS manually, then yes, I automated, but I didn't give the team the speed to release that they needed. I need to move faster. The other thing is automation is a journey. Y'all don't take too long, right? This is where you've been looking at automation. The developers, though, they're moving faster than most security teams or NetOps teams when it comes to automation. So one of the things I would challenge you is go back and challenge your vendors to help you along that journey. So when I come into you in your office, we sit down, and I say I have an API. What does that mean to you? What does that mean to you? Integration? Yeah. That means that, sir, I'm telling you, you have to become a domain expert in my product. You also have to become a domain expert in my APIs, and then you get to glue that together. Right? Really what I want is my vendor coming in and giving me solutions that allow me to implement quickly today. So, for example, Ansible modules, Terraform playbooks, moving from imperative APIs and moving more towards declarative APIs. I want to try to target pipeline integration in all use cases that I can. A lot of the NetOps and SecOps teams that I work with, pipeline automation isn't their first focus. They're just trying to enable something like ServiceNow to be able to deploy an app. And so that's great for the business units that deploy off-the-shelf code. But for those of us that write code for our companies, the pipeline is where I want that integration. So I mentioned the automation journey, that imperative versus declarative. And I do want to touch on this because it's important. When I tell you I have an imperative process, that means that I'm relying upon you to be that domain expert. So I'll give you an example. The customer that said, we want to hit 80%. We told them that the reason they were having delays in deployments is that the security team had a 4-week SLA to obtain a new certificate. 4 weeks. If your deployment of your app takes 4 minutes, right, that's a long time to wait to get a new cert to deploy that application. So they realized this was a pain point, they looked at Gartner's Magic Quadrant and chose one of the vendors that was a leader, and they had a couple of us on the call with them. And so I asked the vendor, do you have Ansible modules? You wanted the response? I have a robust API. Okay, that didn't really answer my question. Do you have an API documentation so that we can write Ansible modules? Can you guess the response? We've got a robust API. What did that vendor tell us? That you, as the customer, are going to have to implement all of this yourselves. So when we look at imperative APIs, that's what that is. You have to come up with the process. So an imperative API tells the system how to do something every step of the way. The common analogy I give is, who's familiar with Subway? Right? I go in, I get a sandwich. I'm going to have to tell the person behind the counter everything they have to do to make that sandwich. Now, I have the sandwich in my head, the idea, that end state, that end goal that I want. That's the equivalent of your application. So I tell them what type of bread, whether I want it toasted, what toppings, all of this process. So yes, they are facilitating the making of my sandwich, but I am still heavily involved, and I have to know the sandwich I want. Versus a declarative API, tell the system what you want and let it figure out how it achieves that. So this is the Jimmy John's approach, right? No matter where I go in the United States, I know that I can order number 14, which is a bootlegger, and it will be the same everywhere I go. Now, I don't have to tell the person how to make the bootlegger. They know how to do it. And another important thing about this process is it still allows some variances, right? I can add cheese or I can not have cheese, but it doesn't affect that sandwich. This is where declarative APIs become extremely powerful. It removes the domain level expertise that's required to deploy security tools. And it allows your NetOps, your SecOps, and your DevOps teams to really focus on what it is they want to achieve, that end state, and not how they achieve it. So a lot of organizations, when they look at automation, they start off with imperative processes. But I will tell you, eventually it will not scale. One of the customers I was working with, they were down this path, right? Mind you, this is a Fortune 50 customer. They had probably about 30 deployment patterns today, all imperative. They thought that they were going down the right path. And we had to come in and kind of tell them their baby was ugly. And the reason we had to do that is that they will reach a point that no amount of money and no amount of extra personnel will allow them to deploy a new application, because that imperative process has to be recreated every time. Versus a declarative model is something you can iterate upon. That same customer was able to take those 30 apps and create 6 declarative type of applications that address those same use cases. They now can take on new applications much, much faster. So the director of automation there started simple, and this is something I would really, really stress. He said, I want 3 flavors of ice cream: chocolate, vanilla, strawberry. All of my vendors need to help me deliver those 3 flavors of ice cream. Now, we get back to culture here. It's one thing to be able to deliver them, but they also needed all the other business units to understand that for us to be successful, those 3 flavors of ice cream are it. We're not saying you can't have another, but you can't have a developer just come up to me and say, hey, my app requires this custom HTTP header, and therefore you need to redo all your deployments. That doesn't scale. So new flavors, or in this case, unique snowflakes, can happen, but they required VP or director level approval. Everyone was okay with that. That meant that they could get their apps to market faster. Now, eventually those snowflakes will build up to a new flavor of ice cream, and that's where they kind of scaled out, right? But they were able to do it substantially faster. That team went from an app being deployed in 6 weeks to now they can deploy an app in a matter of hours. And if you have a new application type that they hadn't seen before, it takes about a day. And that's really about getting the approvals done. So the lessons learned here, some of the things I want to leave you with, is empowerment of the developers. And this is where we have to really break down those silos. I have to trust that the developer will choose the right tool and will do what is required to meet corporate compliance. This means that if your organization today does not allow a developer to deploy infrastructure, so many of you have probably heard infrastructure as code, right? If they don't have the ability to deploy infrastructure on their own, then ask yourself, why is that? Is that a technical limitation that we're not there yet, or is that a trust issue? If it's a trust issue, I would challenge you to try to address that. Evaluate how we can break down that barrier. Automation is key. We have to do more than just simply having an API. If a vendor comes to you and says you have an API, that's just no longer enough to have a seat at the table. What can I do with that API without having to be an expert in your product? The other things we have to look at is, I'll kind of give this as a stretch to you, is that as teams choose new tools, I need to start looking at moving past integrating directly against vendor APIs and starting to build more of a security as a service. For those of us with development backgrounds, we're already used to this, right? I try to avoid coding directly against a library, and instead I try to build like an API buffer. That way, if that library has a vulnerability, or that library all of a sudden is no longer developed, or for guys that code Python, they didn't write it in Python 3, which is gonna bite me in the butt here in a couple months, I can switch that library out without having to refactor my entire application. Well, the same thing is true with security, right? Taking those development practices that we've been used to and applying them to security. The last thing is ease of use. The story I told you about earlier, why do you think they deployed directly into AWS versus going through the normal process and working with security and working with IT? It was ease. They chose to bypass IT and security because they know that security wouldn't have approved what they were trying to do. So how do we make our processes easier for the developers to consume? Part of that is giving them integrations into their code deployment pipelines that automatically put the security at least at a level that allows us to meet corporate compliance. The other thing is we must make it easier. This is a challenge that I work on with a lot of customers that when they start their automation journey, they're like, hey, look at these 3,000 lines of Ansible that tie all of this together. And we tell them that's a good first step. But if you're going to expect your developer to try to do that, we need to make it simpler. And that's where I would challenge you, or that next stretch goal, and the final one, is we have to move security away from being a service that IT provides. And security has to almost become its own business unit. And what I mean by that is you have to start considering the product that you're offering your internal customer. In today's market, there's a lot of things that I can use. And if I feel that choosing a SaaS service from some other vendor achieves my goals, then I'm going to choose that because it's easier, versus it may not meet all the corporate compliance. But if security starts to think like a business unit, then they start to think about how the internal customer consumes their product and start to think about how do I drive my goals away from just ensuring that, hey, we didn't have a breach, to ensuring that we didn't have a breach and that I made it easier for my developers to innately build security into their pipelines. So this is where I'd like to wrap up. I'm here, can definitely answer questions, but kind of some guidance that I've seen working with customers over my career at F5 and then as a developer for 14 years. So thank you.